really interesting. And we welcome you from wherever you are right now. I used to be in the Bay Area for 10 years. Now I'm calling in from Colorado. And I'll hand it over to you, Simone, to introduce yourself briefly, and then you, Suzanne.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Shira, and thank you, Suzanne, for being here with me today, and to the Mountain View Library. I was a longtime Mountain View resident. I lived in Mountain View for 11 years and just recently left to move to Redwood City. So yeah, I have a background in economics and public policy, and my book is Manflu, which is about a world where men have been weakened or killed by a virus, which we're going to get into. And I also wanted to mention that I have 2 sons, so I don't really want all men to be killed. Don't worry about that. And I've been married for 14 years to my wonderful husband. I should also mention that I work at an organization in Mountain View, Community Services Agency. It's a safety net nonprofit that many of you are probably familiar with, and I'm a data analyst there. Did I forget anything, Shira?
No, that was perfect. We'll get to everything else in a moment. Thank you, Suzanne.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for coming. Oh, Shira, do you want to advance to our slide with our photos?
Oh, happy to.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. I grew up in San Jose and went to high school in Cupertino. I now live in Colorado, but it's been really fun to have this full circle with my Bay Area connection and connected with Simone, and we got this event set up. So my name's Suzanne. I'm the author of End of Men, which I released in November of 2020. And connected with Simone through an advertising class that we took together, and both realized the connection between our books. And I also have 3 stepsons and a wonderful husband. And we wanted to emphasize, despite the title of this topic, we have wonderful men that we love in our lives. And so we'll be exploring all kinds of fun things about gender roles and the themes of our books and why we wrote them, what spawned them, connections to the pandemic. That's about it.
Yeah. So if you were hoping to come to this and learn about how to use Manflu to bring about the end of men, probably not gonna get you there. But one of the things I love, Simone and Suzanne, is that you met because you connected because your books were related to each other thematically. And I think we'll have a really interesting conversation today that's really relevant to a lot of current event themes, even though these books are based on the future. So we've done Meet the Authors. We'll talk a little bit about each of the books, not give anything away, just give you enough background to follow along. And then we'll talk a little bit about the adventure of writing and publishing in such a strange time, and spend the bulk of our time on dystopian worlds and what we can learn from them. And then, of course, drop questions in the chat anytime, and we'll do a Q&A at the end based on all of those. So, Simone, I'd love you to give us a little overview of Manflu, especially around like who's the main character, how is it set up, and what's the theme?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Manflu takes place in the future in a world where men have been killed or weakened by a virus. And I don't think I mentioned this before, but I actually started writing the book before the COVID pandemic. So this idea was in my brain before the current events. And in this world, there's a vaccine researcher, Dr. Morgan Digby, who's married to a man bedbound after his bout with Manflu. And she has to take care of him and also do her research to find a vaccine for Manflu. That's her job. So things keep coming up to prevent her from finding this vaccine. And also, of course, there's a handsome neighbor who she soon meets. And the handsome neighbor has never been infected with Manflu, and that gives her an extra incentive to find the vaccine. Yeah. Did that cover it, Shira?
Yeah. Do you think that it's your fault that we had a pandemic? You were writing this world, and I remember I was reading it with you a little bit as you were writing, and I was afraid it was coming true.
That did get scary at some points. I was predicting a little bit of what was happening in the real world as I was finishing it up.
Yeah, it was amazing and scary. Suzanne, what about you? Did you start your book before the pandemic, and tell us a little bit about your character and your theme?
I did. So yes, ironically, I actually started my book over 10 years ago, believe it or not, and picked it up and put it back down a lot over the years. So mine takes a little bit of a different spin, whereas Simone's is in a world where men have already been weakened by this Manflu virus. Mine takes place in a not so distant America where violence has spiraled out of control, and basically all of the bad trends that we're seeing today continue. And this reporter is suffering from PTSD and goes back to work and is trying to get back into her groove. And she discovers a story where males have stopped being born. So it's been 2 days. There's been no males born across the United States. And she starts digging in to find out why, and discovers a connection between this epidemic of violence that's been kind of breaking the nation apart and this new pandemic that's going on where males are not being born. And it all traces back to the Y chromosome. So really the main character is, even though it's a story that has a lot of science in it, it's really a story about her emotional journey. So her recovering from the death of her father, trying to find her way in the world again and getting through that grief and anxiety. And it really touches on the resilience it takes, that when the world feels like it's falling apart and we're pushed to our limits, what is it that gives us the courage to keep going and to meet some goal that's greater than ourselves?
Amazing. And one of the things I really enjoyed about your book, Suzanne, was that the character says she isn't very comfortable with science, but as you just said, there's a lot of science in the book. And I think that helps bring out her strength in handling it. I'm curious, Suzanne, where do you think you came up with the idea or the theme for this?
I actually remember the day I came up with the idea. I was working as a greeting card writer at the time in Boulder, where Shira is now. And I was reading a story. I was in a fight with my ex-husband, and I was reading a story about Rosie O'Donnell and her partner like doing in vitro or something. And I was just thinking, like, gosh, we don't even need men anymore. Women can do everything that men can do. We can make our own money, have our own careers. We can even have babies on our own. Like, we don't even need men. And I was venting to some girlfriends. And then I was like, that'd be a really interesting idea for a book. Like, what if men just stopped being born? And I am also not into science, but as I started exploring this idea, I learned that it has happened to other species, and learned a lot about lizards and moles and things that I never thought I would care about. But it's pretty fascinating to get into that scientific part of it and look closer at the Y chromosome and what is it that makes us genetically who we are.
Yeah, when we get to Q&A, I kind of want to ask what ads you get in your Google based on those search results. Simone, what about you? Where did you come up with this idea pre-pandemic of a Manflu pandemic?
Yeah, that's interesting what Suzanne said about kind of being annoyed with men and getting the idea, because I kind of had a similar experience, but it wasn't on a personal level. It was more on a societal level. A lot of my writing has come out of being frustrated with events that are happening in the world. And I started writing in 2019, and I don't know if you all remember that, but it was the peak of the Me Too movement, where it seemed like every day another man was in the news for doing something just ridiculous and horrible. And so those men were brought out of power. And I thought, well, what if all these men just got out of the way and gave women a turn in charge? Of course, not all men are bad or all men in leadership, but the news stories were becoming really overwhelming. And I just thought it would be interesting to create a society where men were sidelined somehow, and that could give women a turn in charge. And what would happen? I would just be curious to see what would happen with women in charge. Not to say that everything would be great or everything would be perfect, but certainly some things might be better. And that's what my book explores, what might be better, what might be different in a world with women in charge.
Amazing. Well, we will get into the worlds with women in charge, and where each of you have taken that. But right before we do that, we thought it would be really interesting to talk about publishing during a pandemic. And some of our audience members maybe tried to do that. Some of them maybe have no background in publishing, but it's an adventure. You are both debut novelists. This is your first books. And so you are navigating a whole new world of trying to get your writing out into the world, and obviously successfully, because we're here today. But I'm curious, and maybe Suzanne, this time we'll start with you. Like, how did you find the time to write? How did you pace yourself? What surprised you about the process?
Yeah. So finding the time to write, I've realized that a big part for me, writing can be, as we all know, a really solitary act. And I realized early on, like, in order to keep going, I had to make groups and classes and retreats a big part of my process. So going and talking about my story to other people, sharing it, workshopping it. So I definitely, as I mentioned before, I picked it up and started it, stopped it, gave up on it, came back to it many, many times over a decade. And sometimes literally was like, is this thing ever going to be done? And interestingly, the pandemic gave me a push to finish it. I had gotten a final round of edits from a developmental editor, and I was so tired of working on it. I didn't want to do it anymore. And then the pandemic was happening, and I started seeing themes of what was happening in my book. Even though it's different, it's not about a virus. It is a world where the violence has gotten so bad that people are afraid to leave their homes. And when they do, they're wearing vests. And like, there's, you can't have big gatherings of people because they're afraid there will be attacks. So I started seeing all these similarities in the real world happening. And it was like, oh my gosh, what's going on? If I'm going to finish this, it has to be now. And I think, like so many of us, the pandemic just makes you realize, like, life is uncertain. If there's something I want to do, I need to do it. So the pandemic in a lot of ways gave me a push that I needed to actually finish it and find the courage to just put it out there. And I self-published, which I think we're going to get into a little bit of discussion on the different models of publishing. But yeah, that was kind of my experience and my process. And I wouldn't advise anyone to follow my pace because I avoided it for so long. If I had just buckled down and done it, I could have had but it was the way it needed to happen. So I beat myself up a little bit, but it's okay.
Well, it's out now.
It's out, exactly.
It's a great book. So thank you for the grueling process. Simone, what about you? How did you find the time to write with 2 sons at home and a pandemic raging?
Yeah, so in some ways my experience was similar. In some ways it was different from Suzanne's. So my process was much faster, but it was also the pandemic that pushed me in the end. So I started writing in the summer of 2019, and I just did it as a fun, creative project at that point. And then in February of 2020, I went to a writing conference. So like Suzanne, writing conferences are really important, and other writing resources, which we can talk about. And at that conference, I met the people who would publish the book, and they were interested in the book right away because we already knew that there was this pandemic coming. It was in Asia at that point. It wasn't here in the US yet, but we knew it was coming. And they said, this is really timely. You have to finish this. So I kept going with it. And the fact that we were in a pandemic pushed me to finish it, because it was kind of, this is the time, it's now or never. If writing a novel is kind of on my bucket list, and this one really might have legs, so let me get it done. That was my thought process. And I finished most of the writing around September of 2020, and then spent a few months editing, and it just came out in March. I was going to say something, I'm forgetting. Something about the, I don't remember. It'll come back to me.
Is there anything that particularly surprised you about your writing experience?
Oh, I know now. I know because you asked me about writing with kids at home. That's what I was going to get into. Surprised me, just how long it takes to actually write a whole book. I mean, that seems kind of obvious, but you may not realize until you're actually in the middle of it. But what I was going to say about writing with kids at home is that I was just all pandemicked out, because I was writing this book about a pandemic, and I had the kids at home because they couldn't go to in-person school. And I was working at CSA dealing with the flood of people coming in to seek assistance because of the pandemic. So we had 1,300 new household clients come in throughout the pandemic. We were doing rental assistance for most of those people, serving them in the food pantry. And I was actually going into the office to assist, because a lot of our volunteers couldn't come in at that time. Many of them are retired and they're in high-risk groups. So I was dealing with the frontline work of a pandemic during the day, dealing with my kids being home and then trying to get this book written. So
Yeah.
that's, yeah, I wanted to make sure to mention all of that. It was a lot of pandemic at once.
Even more pandemic than most people experience, which was already a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks. Suzanne, you alluded to the publishing route that you chose, and actually, Simone, you mentioned it as well. So maybe, Suzanne, you can explain how publishing has been done for most of time, and then it's an industry that's been disrupted, which if anyone is coming from Mountain View and hasn't heard of industries being disrupted, I'm not really sure how you got through it, but it's another industry that's been disrupted. So maybe, Suzanne, you can tell us a little of the history and then how you navigated the new opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who aren't familiar, so traditional publishing is the route that most people think of when they think, oh, I want to publish a book one day. So a traditional form of publishing, the way it's typically been done in most of the past, is basically you write a draft and then you start pitching it to agents in order to get one of they call them the big five. So there's 5 big publishing houses that are responsible for, I don't know the stat, but it's probably like 90% of the top bestsellers that are out there. So anything that you see in bookstores and distributed all over the place, they have all these connections. So in order to get one of these publishing houses to even look at your book, you first need to get an agent. So the process is like this multiple thing of pitching to agents, and the agents are getting floods and floods of manuscripts. And unless something really grabs them and you know exactly what they're looking for and it's a perfect match, it can be really challenging. So I actually finished the draft of my book probably 4 years ago and was pitching it to agents, got some interest, but nothing. And I was really set on doing traditional publishing. I just wanted that. I knew that if I wanted just the dream that I had as a child of it being in these bookstores and being on Oprah and all of those things, that was really the only way to get those big distributions. But there are a lot of drawbacks as well. So as I started facing the difficulties of finding an agent and going through and getting a developmental editor to make the manuscript stronger and hopefully get representation, I started learning more about how publishing had been disrupted even before the pandemic, but I think even more so now. People are consuming media because they can't go out, and so people are more willing to try other authors. And I've seen a ton of like the classes that Simone and I took about Amazon advertising and how many books you can sell. There's people who are reading a book a day and they are willing to try new authors. And so as self-published author, you can really, with Amazon and the different distribution models, get into the hands of some people if you go your own route. So with self-publishing, what's different is you control everything. So whereas if you get an agent and a traditional publisher, the process takes a really long time. The pandemic, like I read about so many authors who were going to be debuting their books, and then the pandemic started and everything came screeching to a halt. And so these people, like all of their plans were disrupted, their dreams that they had been waiting for changed. Whereas going the self-publishing route, I was able to control everything and look at the election and what was happening in the world and figure out, okay, I think this is going to be a timely time for this. I don't have 2 years to wait. So yeah, self-publishing, there's so many resources online. So if anyone is interested in self-publishing a book, it was really surprising to me how much you can do on your own. Did I miss anything, Simone?
No, no, I think you really covered it. I guess I can just jump into my experience too. So what I did was hybrid publishing, which is kind of like self-publishing with assistance. And similar to you, I didn't want to wait all that time, especially because I was writing about a pandemic and the thought of waiting 2 years. I mean, the moment would have definitely passed by then. And so I was busy, dealing with life in a pandemic. So it really made sense to me to go with the hybrid publishers that I met at the writing conference. And I really like their story. It's Acorn Publishing. They're 2 women who are writers themselves and didn't like the traditional way of publishing and felt like they had something to offer because they've gone through the whole process themselves. So they started a company to help other authors publish their books. And so hybrid publishing works by the publisher kind of taking care of all those tasks that an author may not want to do themselves, like designing a cover or coming up with what genre your book is in, just little details that really add up. And they either do it or walk you through it. And then they don't maintain any of the rights to your book. So I have all the rights to my book now. That is one thing Suzanne didn't quite mention, but when you publish traditionally, the publisher takes a percentage of your royalties. So if you self-publish or you hybrid publish, then you don't have that situation.
Yeah, and I think I've read, that's a good point. I think I've read, usually you get an advance when you do traditional publishing, and most people don't get anything beyond that because they don't sell enough. So that's one reason publishers are so hesitant to take on new authors, because it is really rare to become a bestseller, and they make all of their money from this small niche group of people who write bestseller after bestseller.
Yeah, it's been interesting learning about the whole world of publishing and book sales throughout this process. I mean, my brain has really expanded.
Fascinating. Before we move on to like violence and climate change, do you have one piece of advice you would give to new writers, if there are any in our audience?
I'll go first because I think Suzanne's gone first for a bunch of these.
You go.
Yeah, well, attending a writing conference is great. Shira and I will both be at the Southern California Writing Conference in Irvine in September, if anyone wants to join us there. Yeah, and then that's more of an investment, but if you're looking for some free, easy advice, I would definitely suggest the #MWriting podcast. Podcasts are free, you can go through and find any episode that pertains to whatever you're working on. So that's definitely where I would start. Also Instagram, if you're on there are a ton of accounts that have tips for writing. Also, I have a kind of a list of, I think it's like 14, not totally random number, things to think about when you're writing a novel that I'm happy to send anyone. And a lot of people post things like that on Instagram. Yeah, I think that'd be a good resource.
And we'll put up everyone's email address at the end. So if you want those resources from Simone, you can grab her email. Suzanne, a piece of advice from you?
Yeah, I think similarly, I mentioned also like Simone, like community was the biggest thing for me, just realizing that authors and other writers, like we can thrive together and the creative community as a whole. So writing can be, and in the past has been, a really solitary act, but it can be this collaborative journey, and that everybody goes through the same stuff. And I started asking and talking to other local authors that I discovered, and people who would be like, oh, my mom wrote a book, or introducing me to people who had self-published or who had agents. And people are so willing to share their experience and their advice and their resources. They love talking about it. So that would be my biggest thing, is like building a community. And then one other, just because that was, me and Simone's were kind of similar, but don't edit as you go. I think that was what slowed me down so much. I would write like 3 chapters and then I'd go back and I'd perfect them. And anytime I'd sit down to write, I'd start at chapter 1 and keep editing and like fine tuning every little word. And it just took forever. It's like, just get your first draft done, then go back. That would be I'm working on my next novel now, and that's the way I'm trying to do it. It's hard if you're a perfectionist though. So, just let go of that and just go.
Amazing life lessons. Well, I feel like that's an easy transition straight into violence. So maybe we'll talk about that. Simone said Suzanne's been going first a lot, so Simone, I'll start with you. But violence plays a role in both of your books. Suzanne mentioned that there's a rising tide of violence in hers, so she'll probably go into some depth. But we'll talk a little bit about the role of violence in the world that you foresee in your book.
Yeah, so violence is different in both of our books. Suzanne does talk about increasing violence, but in my book, it's actually decreasing violence, because I imagine a world run by women and with the majority women would have less violence. And maybe some people might disagree with that, but I think it's a pretty fair imagining of what the world would be. And as a policy person, I thought about what the policy implications are of having women in charge and having fewer men and less violence. And one thing I came up with was there would be a need for much less military spending, I actually checked the numbers, and over half of the federal discretionary budget goes to defense spending. So billions and billions of dollars. And if the military was reduced because we had less violence, that money could be repurposed for things like caregiving or infrastructure, other really important priorities for society. So that's the direction I saw with decreasing violence potentially in the future.
Amazing. And Suzanne, go ahead and contrast that with what you see.
Yeah, and mine is the opposite, but actually similar, where seeing just a connection between males and violence, and if there was a world with all women, would it be less violent? And so my book takes place in a future where, as I mentioned, the birth pattern has really just begun. So the world is where just violence has kind of spiraled out of control. People are afraid to leave their homes because of mass attacks happening all the time. And so when this birth, and they start investigating a phenomenon that they're starting to call male pattern violence, where things are happening where the attackers are younger and younger, the horrible things that we're seeing in our world today. I think a lot of it came from, I was a student at CU when Columbine happened, and it just really shook me. And I know with the recent events, there may be others where this is a sensitive subject. And my book was a way to explore that, just wanting to explore how can we make it so this future doesn't happen. So mine is a violent world. And when males stop being born, they start wondering if it's been conspired somehow. And it seems to be some type of conspiracy meant to start on a more peaceful trajectory.
Yeah, thanks. Do you feel like you see signs of the futures that you created today? And you mentioned that a little bit, but
yeah, my weirdest one, and even readers pointed out to me, because mine was a world where when people did go out, they had all these shields and protection, and I had, like, in restaurants, there were these bubbles that you ate in, and they were in bulletproof glass. And so when the pandemic started happening and those little restaurant bubbles started popping up, I was like, oh my gosh, this is just too weird. And the, like, capacity limits that they put on public events. So yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of trends where it's like, wait, what's going on here?
Yeah. And Simone, does your sense of violence and the kind of association with males impact the way you raise your boys?
I think that social emotional learning is really important, and hopefully a way to reduce violence in the future. And actually, when my kids were at Mistral, they've since left that school, but they attended for a while, and I was involved in Project Cornerstone, which the purpose of it is to teach social emotional learning and have parent volunteers go into the classrooms to read books on that topic once a month, and work with the teachers on lessons to make sure that kids are getting that dimension too. And I think when we were all in school, that wasn't really a topic that was supposed to be addressed in school. School was more for academic purposes, and now school is doing so much more. And so I like that program as a way to hopefully improve things in the future. I mean, not just for boys, not just for my sons, but for kids overall, being in touch with their feelings, being able to express their feelings, and that as a way to reduce bullying, reduce violence, and hopefully create a healthier next generation with fewer of these issues that we have today.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot too. I have 3 stepsons that I've been their stepmom for a couple of years now, and just seeing the way that they, the way that they are grappling with emotions and trying to understand how to express them, and trying to encourage them to express them is something that I've put a big focus on as we're raising them. Just trying to, when they seem to tend toward anger, trying to look closer at what is that pain that's underneath that's causing that anger or that lashing out. And of course, it's not only males and boys, but it is like, there are trends that are different. And I've noticed differences in the way that they play and the things that the games that they go toward. And so just being aware of those issues and being sensitive to all of it.
Have your families read your books, and what did they think?
My husband has read it, and we've talked about our oldest stepson is 12. And so I'm like, there's a scene that we need to rip out if we're going to give you this book. But yeah, we talked about having him read it and getting his thoughts, and they helped me pick the cover, and they know what it's about and everything. And it's been fun having them on this journey too, where they've been really supportive and encouraging, and they're a little too young to read it for now though.
My kids are definitely too young to read it. They're 7 and almost 10. But they did, I've been working on the audiobook. I have a narrator who's recording it, and I've had to listen to the sessions. And so they've been in the room sometimes when I'm listening to the audiobook, and then I'm like, oh, nope, you can't listen to this part.
Simone, I think I remember your son decided to write a book while you were writing your book. Is that right?
Oh yeah, my kids that's been nice. I haven't expected that, but they've been really motivated by seeing me writing and just devoting all that time to it. So my younger son, I mean, he's only 7, but he wrote a book about animals and, found pictures and got the book printed with one of his teachers. So that was really cute. And then my older son, actually, we have a pretty good idea for a book. We may do it. I'm not sure, but it's Freakonomics for kids. So we started working on that, and then we kind of put it aside, but maybe we'll get back into it. He seems really interested. He listens to podcasts on economics, and I have an economics background. So look out for our Freakonomics for Kids book coming out.
Love it. Amazing.
I agree. That has been cool to model that lesson for them. Like, you can have a dream and make it come true. And they definitely, I can see that resonating with them, where they're like, oh, your book. And, having that lesson proved out is really cool.
I think anything that you can do that's a long-term project where the kids can see that you're putting in effort day after day for a long time, and then there's something that happens at the end of that can be really rewarding and a good lesson for them. And it could be writing, or it could be something else, but they do watch what we do. We are role models, whether we like it or not.
Amazing. I love the impact, and I want to see both of your kids' books in their futures. Let's shift the conversation to another theme that is touched on in both of your books, which is climate change. And maybe, Simone, if you want to start us off again, I think this is also an area of contrast between your two books.
Yeah, so similar to decreasing violence, I felt that climate change would be ameliorated by fewer people and fewer men existing in the world. A lot of climate change is because of the products that we use or the food that we eat, and just reducing the population reduces the demand on the planet. And I saw that issue reversing itself, similar to how we saw at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, where travel decreased and there were fewer flights, and just activity decreased, and then all of a sudden the skies were clearing up, there was less pollution. That's kind of how I saw things unfolding with a Manflu pandemic.
Yeah, amazing. Makes sense. And Suzanne, you kind of took the worst of today and grew it, right?
I did. I look back, I'm like, why can't I write something happier? What? Yeah, mine definitely, it was very hot. So it starts in February, and it's like 90 degrees and getting hotter by the day. And that's another place where people just are shielding themselves from the natural world. Everything seems to be a threat. So not only are they like sheltering in their homes because of violence and being afraid of being out in the world, but it's scorching hot, and just like the entire atmosphere is stifling. And so people are increasingly just wanting to stay in their air-conditioned homes and watch media, and not push themselves to really live in the real world.
Yeah, and I think the food's different, right? I mean,
yeah. So a lot of the foods that people are consuming, because farms are struggling so much because of all the climate change and the drought and all of that. So most of the food that people are eating are genetically modified and mass manufactured. Chocolate is extinct, like all these things that we know and love. I know, sad.
That's in my book too.
Really?
My book has the magic low-calorie chocolate that, of course, women would invent first thing when they're in charge of the world.
Can we get some of that, please?
Yes.
Will be mailed to all the participants in this event. I love the chocolates in both of them. Amazing. So another theme that we found when we were looking at the two books is around family planning. I mean, if you have a world that has fewer males or males in different abilities, then you have to look at family planning in a different way, which I assume is one of the reasons that you don't want your kids to read your books. But I'm curious, maybe Suzanne, this time we'll start with you about how family planning is unfolding and how you think it'll shift, and kind of what pressure it puts on people's lives that it looks like only girls are being born.
Yeah. And so there's a couple of scenes early on where I kind of tried to allude to different things going on in the world. So the main character is Charlie and her best friend is Marika. And Marika's single and out there dating, and she's a successful career woman. And she's talking to Charlie about like her latest speed date where they do it in the morning and they're all online and you don't know who is who. And they just have like 3 males and 10 females and you don't know who is who, and you just see who would be the best life partner for you. And so there's this increasing kind of theme throughout the book about societal shifts in terms of same-sex relationships and how that might change if there were only one sex. I think we've seen society's views on the entire topic change a ton over the past like few decades, and I think they'll continue going in that direction where there's just more fluidity, more acceptance of people as people, and less focus on the traditional norms of the past. So that's kind of how it impacts tomorrow in my book, where there start to be less eligible men and women are feeling safer and more comfortable with each other.
Yeah, and your book is at the beginning of that happening, and Simone's yours is many years later. So talk about the pressure on society and how things have changed there.
Yeah, so Manflu impacts men's ability to reproduce. And so if people want to have children, they have to go to a sperm bank pretty much in most cases. So that features heavily in Manflu. And not only do they go to the sperm bank, but they're selecting sperm that's for female babies because they don't want babies that are at risk of getting Manflu. So I don't want to say too much because it will cause some spoilers, but the men who are still able to donate sperm are very popular in this new world because there are few of them.
Both of you seemed a little obsessed with sperm donation, just saying.
Well, I think there's some truth to this in how the real future will unfold, because we see that people want to control the genetic makeup of their children, and so that kind of has to be done in the test tube. That can't be the natural way of having children. So I think that sperm donation, sperm bank, anything like that, it will feature heavily in some kind of future, whatever future we end up having. It will play a part.
Yeah. In mine, they're paying premium dollar for sperm as they realize no more males are being born. A, they want to stockpile the sperm, and B, they're wanting to get as much as they can so they can test it and see if there's any way that, does this one have Y chromosome that could be passed on, doing all kinds of tests on it. And if people have high quality sperm, they're getting a premium dollar. And so then bridges start crumbling and like roads are falling apart as males are leaving their jobs to try and cash in on this sperm lottery. So that part I had a little bit of fun with, just imagining what that might be like.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about the changes in workforce that you just mentioned.
Yeah, so those were a couple of big ones that I hadn't even thought of really. And my book is kind of in 2 parts. So the first part is when this phenomenon first starts being noticed and it's just 2 days in. And then the next part 2, is like months later where it's been continuing. And so people know like this is going on, and there's, they start looking at other routes. So yeah, workforce in terms of like construction crews, that was a big one where I was thinking like, well, how is that going to impact who's out there and actually doing the work? Police force, isn't that one that was in your book as well? Like the police force and firefighters. I'm trying to think of others.
Yeah, mine was focused on mechanics and plumbers and struggles to get those types of people to do the jobs when men are no longer up and about. But my book also addresses that with this new money that's saved by reducing military spending, we can afford job training programs, which will get the women up to speed, and they can take that stuff right over.
Yeah, and another more subtle thing on mine, I guess, is the main character is Charlie, and she's an investigative reporter, and then her production assistant is David. And so most of the pairs that I mention in the book, the assistant is the male, and the boss and the leader is the female. So just kind of playing with those roles and looking at what that looks like if it's reversed.
Yeah, and
I know what you're gonna say is that we both have female presidents in our books. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
And mine was like Hatcher. Of course, I had to play on the egg situation, Hatcher.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else picked that up, but.
But what it was really interesting, thinking about what actually has come true or what's true to reality was when Kamala Harris became vice president. And that was a moment where it was like, okay, well, there are, she's not president, but, getting close to having a female in charge. And that was exciting and also true to the books.
Yeah. And I was actually working on my book when the Trump and when Hillary was defeated, I should say. And so I remember being like, oh my gosh, how's the world going to change when we have a female president? It's happening right now. Oh, no, it's not. Okay. And just adjusting. And yeah, the little tweaks you make as the world changes, the little tweaks you make to the world you envision in the future.
You said the wrong part of my book's coming true. What's the other part? I think that those were the biggest topics that we wanted to dive into. We can dive into more in the Q&A, but a couple questions before we go into that. And the first is, what would you say is the takeaway from each of your books? And I don't care what order we go in. Simone, you want to start?
Yeah. When we were planning the event, we talked about the themes of books, and we had an interesting chat about that. And I said the theme of my book is that love doesn't always look the way you think it will. And that's something that the main character discovers as she lives her life, and different things happen to her, and she sees who she can rely on, and what her life eventually ends up looking like. She had dreamed of kind of a husband, 2.1 kids, white picket fence kind of a situation, and that's not how her life turned out. But she learned to appreciate what she had, and the relationships and the people that love her and care about her. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us, that maybe things don't turn out exactly the way we think, but we can appreciate those in our lives who do love us.
Awesome.
Yeah. So
what about you, Suzanne?
I think my theme would be we're all stronger than we think. So it's something that comes up several times throughout the book. And really the main character is just put in this situation where she's had to overcome extreme adversity. The world is just such a difficult place. And so there's kind of a juxtaposition of her mom is kind of off living in this luxury haven where you can just hide away from reality and not have to worry about all these problems. And her dad, who has passed away, was always out there fighting and wanting to change the world. And she's kind of caught in between and feels that tug of just wanting to give up because it's so hard sometimes, and not feeling like she's good enough to do it. And the challenges are just too great. But she, is kind of in this place of trying to push through and getting encouragement from her friend who I mentioned and others in her life, and just trying to discover strength in her and build that resilience. So yeah, the theme of we're all stronger than we think, I think is mine.
Wonderful. I love that there are positive themes to dystopian novels. That's how I want it to be. Before we jump into Q&A, what are you working on now?
So I am working on getting a tan over the summer. I've started working on my next book, and then I think I'm still a little scared because it really is a hard process. And so I'm a little bit like, ooh, I might want to just give myself a couple months to still ruminate on this idea. So I have a couple chapters of another novel written, and I'm excited to dive back in, but I'm also just enjoying the time with family and getting to travel again and get tan by the pool. Is that terrible to say?
Wear sunscreen. What about you, Simone? What's on your
I was gonna
mind?
say that too. Wear sunscreen, the climate, I don't know how it is right now.
Seriously.
For me, I have an idea for another book, but I'm not sure. I'm kind of noodling around with it. But what I've been doing lately is writing essays, and I started writing essays in the beginning of the pandemic to express how I was feeling about being on the front lines as an essential worker. And I continued writing them, and now I've been writing a lot about it, my experience as a mother coming out of the pandemic, and other topics. And I had my first essay published by Scary Mommy this past week, so that was really exciting. That's a big website for moms. So I'm enjoying writing the essays. It's shorter and provides sort of immediate gratification versus a year of writing a book or whatever it takes. So I'm planning to continue with that for now.
That's really awesome, Simone. I remember you inspired me. I was like, maybe I should try a shorter thing. Yeah, that's really awesome.
So you can find both of their pieces. You can get some insights that they mentioned and advice. Their emails are here, their websites. They've also both hopped into virtual book clubs. So no matter where you're coming in from, if you want to have a book club on one of these books with your friends, you can email them and they're happy to join as an author, which is pretty cool. Get a celebrity in your book club. And yeah, let's take some questions. Kyle, do we have some questions?
Yes, and great. Thank you so much, Shira and Simone and Suzanne, for that great discussion. So we did receive some good questions here. So I really like this one. Would you want to live in the society you created? Let's start with Suzanne.
Definitely not. It's really like the worst of all worlds. Although the luxury havens that I mentioned, they're like these utopian kind of escapes. And sometimes I'm like, especially lately, I'm like, that wouldn't be too bad living there for a couple of months. But the actual society is, unfortunately, it's a very dark place where, scary. It made it so that today seemed a little less scary because my world was even worse. So maybe that's a bright side of it.
For me, I think the actual world is not bad. I mean, the women are, doing a lot of the right things, and I'm into kind of women's spaces. That all sounds fine, but I think the hard part is the painful process of getting to that world because they've lost all these men that are so important in their lives, or the men are weakened and they're taking care of them. And, that kind of echoes what we've seen with COVID, and people are dealing with that grief. So I think that part would be really hard, but the world itself might not be that bad.
Good question.
Thank you both for that. So we received another question here saying, you mentioned family planning. I was reminded of my husband who lived under a single parent for the first 10 years. And then again, he was in his 20s. When he converses with his mother and reaches an unsavory point, he says to his mother, "Hey, egg donor, can you hear me? How would you feel if your children addressed you that way?" I'll start with Simone on this one.
Thanks, Kyle. I don't know, my kids say all kinds of rude things, but they haven't come up with that one yet. I might send them to their rooms for a little while to chill out.
How about you, Suzanne?
I was scrolling back to read the question again. So how would I respond to? Will you repeat it?
Yeah, if you were addressed as egg donor, can you hear me? By your own children.
I don't have children, but I have to assume that would not be great. I don't know any kids. Is it meant like, do kids refer to their dads as sperm donor? Is that kind of the illusion?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for that. So we have another question here saying, thank you for the great discussion. Can both authors please say something about their processes in creating their main characters? Let's start with Suzanne on this one.
Yeah, that was a really fun and challenging part of the process for me. I think I had a full draft complete where I really envisioned my character as someone different and some main parts of her story very different. I used the Enneagram. If anyone's familiar with, it's a personality test. And so I've always been fascinated with the Enneagram and personality tests in general. So I kind of used that to help me dig into my character and getting like at the heart of like, what does she really want? And what is she really afraid of? I always had kind of a surface vision of her to start. And so to start, like my very first part of my process was build it after the idea and just, writing a couple chapters. I started doing a character board where I just, cut out pictures from magazines and put that up. Oh, hang on, this little survey. So just cut out magazine pictures, put that up, and just started doing brainstorms on the character, studying the Enneagram, trying to figure out which person she was, and then kind of building from there, her backstory. And there's a lot of great resources from different classes that I took about character interview questions and diving in to get to know them. That was some of my latest revisions, though, was really trying to make her come alive and be empathetic and really getting to know beyond the surface part. So it was definitely the funnest and most challenging part of the process, I would say. Is funnest a word?
You're the author.
And just briefly before Simone answers, I just wanted to mention I did launch the poll. If you have a moment, everyone, to take the poll. It's just 2 questions. That's really helpful for the library. Thank you. And go ahead, Simone.
Yeah, I like doing character profiles. That helps me get to know my character. And yeah, you can look up online and ask yourself questions about the character and start developing what their background would look like. And just think about, as you move through the story, how would the character react to that? And that kind of starts building the character too. And for me, I should mention that the main character is Chinese American, and she just came to me that way, and I went with it. And I did have some Asian and Asian American friends review drafts of my book to make sure that they were comfortable with what I was saying. That was important to me. So it was an interesting process, just writing about a character that's a different race from me. But that's the creative spark. That's just how she arrived in my brain.
That part is cool. We didn't talk about that much, but just the parts that just come to you and you're like, where did that come from? Like some of it is hard and you're striving for it, but some of it just comes, and it's really that feeling of you're downloading something from some greater source. And that part is really fun.
That's so cool. And we have some other questions here, but I also just wanted to ask, Shira, you're a writer yourself. Are you working on anything currently?
Yeah, so I have a blog that I put up before that has shorter things on it. Most recently, a lot about mental health, because that's what I work in and it's so poignant today. But I'm in the process of writing my first novel. And interestingly, for the last question, I spent probably 3 weeks that I thought I should be spending writing. I spent just thinking about the characters and writing about their goals and their histories and why they think the way they do and why they have that perspective, because I realized that the books that I love reading most are the ones where the characters are very compelling and you feel like you're getting to know different individuals. And so I didn't start writing until I had a strong sense of each person, and did some exercises like the ones Simone mentioned on answering questions about them.
Oh, great.
But hopefully you'll host me when I get my book out through either hybrid or self-publishing.
Oh, absolutely. All right, and let's see,
cool.
we have a little bit of time here to answer a few more questions. So this is a good question. In real life, do either of you see a real world trend toward moving toward a female-only society, or both books just playing with the concept? Simone, I'll start with you since your book deals with that a lot. Core part of the book.
I don't see how that could happen unless there is some kind of a pandemic that gets rid of men. No, I don't know. I think it's just a fun idea to think about. But I do think that thinking about ideas like this illuminates what's happening in the world. Like thinking about having women in charge can spark some ideas about, well, what are some policies that women would do, and are those better, and why can't we just do them now anyway? We don't need to kill off men before we maybe put in some caregiving assistance and, you know, infrastructure and some things that might benefit everyone.
And regarding when you're discussing violence and how the big dramatic drop in violence, did you do any kind of research into that? And I'm just curious about both of you, if you could go into a bit of the research process as well.
Yeah.
I think Suzanne did. Yeah.
I did a lot of research. So there's a book called Adam's Curse that really deals with the Y chromosome and it's by a geneticist, and he talks a lot about the flaws in it. And there's several sections on the connections between violence and the Y chromosome. And I did a lot of, like I mentioned, the scientific research where it was something that I wasn't at all interested in. And as I started diving into it, it was really fascinating just to think about how those gender roles play out, not just in humans, but in all kinds of, like I started watching birds. I'm like, oh, the male duck is this way. And like, just thinking about it beyond our normal kind of thought patterns was pretty fascinating to me. So yeah, I did a lot of research into that topic. And that term even was on some discussion board that I read about male pattern violence, and starting to try and look at, like, why is it that most killings are done by males? And that term is meant to, like, it's not only males who commit violence, but there is a pattern. And so it's something really sensitive, obviously, and it can easily turn into this male versus female thing. But I think it's important to look closer at the root causes and really be honest about things that have happened in the past and how we see that the future could unfold differently.
And I don't think I kind of skipped over it, but Suzanne, what do you think? Is there do you see a trend happening in any time in the future where we could go to a female-only society?
I don't think so, but I do think it's interesting to start seeing the shifts in power and the impacts that has on both genders. So as women's empowerment has grown, how is that impacting young boys? Are they being given the same messages of empowerment that our young girls are? Like, if they see something that says is the future female, how does that impact them? And so trying to not swing too far one way or the other, I think is something that's important to keep in mind in this discussion of just both of us bringing the best of ourselves to the table. But yeah, I don't see how we could become female only. I don't think that's in the cards.
Yeah.
Knock on wood though. Like I said, it happened to lizards. So whiptail lizards, I was pretty shocked.
Oh, interesting. And so just really quickly before we wrap up, we have one last question here. Would either of you be drawn to writing a sequel to your novel? Simone, what about you? Is that something you'd think about, or would you just rather write something brand new?
No, I think I'm going in a different direction. After writing for more than a year and editing, and it's like I'm Manflued out. So that to someone the other day. So yeah, I'm ready to move on to different. Yeah, some people write, you know, so many sequels, and I don't know how they do that without kind of wanting to move on. But yeah, I'm ready to move on.
What about you, Suzanne?
Yeah, so mine actually, the end is very much set up for a sequel, but I got to the end and it was, as I mentioned, such a dark world that I was like, I can't go into this. So I'm working on a different book, but I also have the idea for a prequel where there's several story threads that I set up in there about Charlie's dad and how he kind of started his investigation into some of this. So if and when I go back to the End of Men, I'll probably do the prequel first and then the sequel. Yeah, so definitely imagine it as a trilogy though.
Great, that's wonderful. All right, well, big thank you to Shira and Simone and Suzanne for this wonderful discussion. Appreciate you taking the time, and big thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. There is a recording of it available, so we'll be making that available on our library YouTube. So thank you all so much and have a good evening.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Kyle.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.